We're delighted to welcome you to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol. Our session today is The Truth of Yoga. Daniel Simpson in conversation with Ranju Roy. Scholar and author Daniel Simpson's recent book, The Truth of Yoga, takes us on a journey through the origins, development and concept of yoga. Cutting through myth and misinformation, the text provides a comprehensive overview of this age-old discipline which is celebrated worldwide for its mental, physical and spiritual benefits. Simpson teaches courses on yoga philosophy at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies and at Yoga in London. He draws on his experience as a journalist to make the subject accessible. Yoga practitioner and teacher Ranju Roy is the co-author of Embodying the Yoga Sutra, Support Direction Space, and teaches courses on the practice and philosophy of yoga. In conversation with Roy, Simpson delves into the past, present and future of this ancient tradition. Daniel Simpson teaches courses on yoga philosophy at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, at Yoga in London and internationally. He is a graduate of Cambridge University and has a master's degree from SOAS University of London. Our second speaker, Ranju Roy. Ranju is a UK-based yoga teacher in the tradition of TKV Desikachar. Of mixed Indian and English origin, he has practiced yoga for 35 years and taught for 30 years. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section on your screens. Ladies and gentlemen, now presenting The Truth of Yoga, Daniel Simpson in conversation with Ranju Roy. Enjoy the conversation.
Welcome to everybody and welcome also to Daniel. It's great to see you.
Hey, nice to see you, Ranji.
Yeah, cool. Truth of Yoga. So it's just come out. Here it is. Here is my copy of it. It's a great read, and the book is a kind of a comprehensive overview of the history and with some intimations about where yoga is going as well, and the current state of yoga. I think it's beautifully apt for this time in that it's divided up into 100 easy bite-sized chapters. So really, it's very, very accessible. You can read one chapter in 5 or 10 minutes and kind of mull over it and then go back to it, of course, because there's a lot of rich material. And it's divided, you've divided it into these 4 different sections. So the first section is early yoga. Second section is what you've called classical yoga, which is an interesting term, which maybe we'll discuss as well.
Yes.
Then you've got hatha yoga, and finally you've got the section on modern yoga. Let's just start, Daniel, with can you give us an idea of the different flavors of those 4 eras? What's the kind of defining characteristic of each of those?
No, absolutely. I should probably start with a caveat. It's impossible to generalize, and yet at the same time, I've tried to do that by writing a book, so I should abandon any pretense that I can't. I mean, when people come to the question of yoga's history, I think there's a lot of cloudiness about when things actually started. And so the first section of the book really just deals with that, what we might even call prehistory. Times when ideas emerge that are related to subsequent yoga teachings and practices. Particularly, I'm thinking here of the early Vedic traditions, which don't themselves teach yoga as we know it. In fact, the word yoga is used in the Rig Veda to prepare your chariot for going to war. So it's a completely different concept. However, there are many ideas in the Vedas that became influential, and some perhaps even hints of something that people have identified as yoga even prior to the time of Vedic culture, but very, very difficult to find firm evidence on which to base any conclusion that yoga is 5,000 years old, as has often been claimed. So I wanted in this opening chapter to look at, the early seeds of yoga, really, rather than the flowers that burst out of the ground from those initial shoots that we find in later Vedic texts like the Upanishads. In the second section, classical yoga, is really when yoga gets systematized, and really perhaps surprisingly to many, the text that really does that first is the Mahabharata, although it's thought of more in terms of its epic narrative, and there are substantial sections on yoga theory and practice that are more comprehensive in a way than what's said by Patanjali several hundred years later in his Yoga Sutra. in some ways, he's almost just following up on what's already been said. So I use the term classical really because those are sort of texts that people turn to, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita, which is part of the Mahabharata, but there are many other sections in the Mahabharata as well as the Gita that go into detail about yoga. So I look there at how yoga becomes sort of organized as a series of teachings on the discipline of meditation and the possibility of release from suffering, which is a philosophy that's emerged out of this murky beginning somewhere back in prehistory, that influences many teachings, not just yoga. The philosophy and religions of Buddhism and Jainism are from the same sort of inspiration. But that's all about, in some ways, renouncing the world to a certain extent, although the Bhagavad Gita gives it a different spin and says you can renounce through acting without attachment. It's got very little to do with body yoga. It's got very little to do with what most people think of yoga as today. So then I wanted to look at what's different about physical yoga. Where does it come from? How does it draw on two really crucial influences? Asceticism.
Hold on, Daniel. We're going into Hatha yoga now, are we?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Before we do that, can I just ask you a question about the term classical yoga? Because
absolutely,
when people talk, I mean, it's kind of a Western term. It's when we talk about classical, we generally think of the Greek or Roman civilizations or whatever. So can you just say something about how the term classical could be applied to the Mahabharata or Yoga Sutra?
I think there's a parallel to that sort of Western nomenclature is that there's a certain canonicity to these texts. There's a status accorded to both the Yoga Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita in contemporary yoga practice culture and also in Indian spiritual traditions. The Yoga Sutra is the founding document of the philosophical school of yoga, as well as a sort of pithy summary of what's known about meditation. So I think those are the texts to which people first turn, and they have.
So when we talk about classical later. Yeah. When we talk about classical, there's a sort of an iconic status to these texts.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think there's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing in there as well, because I guess I'm by nature a little bit subversive, and I think we should question the canonical status of those texts, certainly in relation to modern yoga practice. They're fascinating sources and full of rich insights, and we can certainly learn a lot from them. But they don't really relate to what most people are doing today and speaking of as yoga, especially not in the West. I think it would be helpful actually to remove that connection and to start thinking more in terms of what has inspired the practice disciplines that have become such a globalized phenomenon. And then at the same time to think, well, okay, if we do then want to go back to these sources of inspiration, what's the relationship we're going to have with them? Because it isn't that sort of canonical, authoritative head of the lineage status, because what we're doing hasn't come directly from those sources. It's come from elsewhere, which is really what I look at in the Hatha Yoga and Modern Yoga chapters. How yoga gets to be a physical practice in the first place, because until about 1,000 years ago, it meant sitting, or doing something very extreme to the body, like standing on one leg for years or holding arms above your head. But it didn't mean performing postures, certainly not in a sequence, and absolutely not in a room wearing overpriced leggings. So I think that we need to first figure out, what are the things that combine to produce these other postures, and that seems to be a mixture of asceticism, doing difficult things to the body, and then at the same time a new philosophy in the form of Tantra that talks about the body not as an obstacle but as a vehicle, a means to transformation, something that can be cultivated, energized, ultimately even divinized, spiritualized, whereas previous teachings on yoga looked at the body as an obstacle, something that had to be sort of transcended, left behind even, in order to free the spiritual principle within. Whereas matter in tantric traditions is part of the divine, and those ideas are there before that. You see a little bit of them in the Bhagavad Gita, even in one of the Upanishads, the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. But Tantra makes that really a completely different way of seeing reality, and that influences physical yoga. But even then, there's a whole new ingredient that produces sequenced group classes for 90 minutes, and all of that seems to come in the modern era, which I felt needed to be looked at separately, because it's all about cross-cultural influence, it seems to me, and it's very difficult to unravel the different strands that have come together to produce what we now think of as yoga practice, because it's a mixture of other Indian traditions that have related to developing strength and flexibility, whether that's martial arts, wrestling, dance even, and then also the ancient traditions of Hatha yoga, but they weren't sequencing postures, they were using postures as a prelude to sit in meditation. So yoga practice involving postures as the means and the end, that's a whole new thing, so that needed its own chapter.
Absolutely. Really. Absolutely. I mean, I remember, just thinking of my own understanding, I the way that I practice, for example, and the way that I teach, I might inhale and raise my arms up and exhale and fold forward. And I was under the impression that this was what they were doing in Vedic times, it's the same practice. And it was it was quite disillusioning and quite a shock to think, wait a minute, this isn't talked about in the ancient texts, and I'm sure they weren't practicing in this way. And as we know, in the canonical Yoga Sutra, there are only 3 sutra which actually talk about asana itself at all. I mean, the majority of it is about very deep meditative states and of samadhis. It's not at all about exhaling and bending forward. But it has become this this touchstone to all that we do. I'd like to ask Daniel, in the spirit of provocation, it's a provocative title, isn't it? The Truth of Yoga. I particularly love this quote from page 9. You quoted Wendy Doniger, I thought it was a very funny quote. She says that, and you've even alluded to it earlier with your reference to yoga meaning putting on a suit of armor, I think somewhere earlier. But Wendy Doniger says, which you've quoted, every Sanskrit word means itself, its opposite, a name of a god, and a position in sexual intercourse. So it's a kind of it's a funny the richness of the Sanskrit language, I suppose, has each word has so many different meanings. And you've said the truth of yoga. So can you say something about is there a truth of yoga, and what yoga are you talking about?
Absolutely. No, it's a bold title, I grant you, and I should probably say a couple of things sort of by way of introduction before I respond directly. I mean, even first about quoting Wendy Doniger, she has herself stoked controversy in India, and has been in a very unfortunate position of having her books pulped because what she says isn't very popular, and some of it is a little bit controversial and designed to be that way, and that statement is an example of that. She's tongue-in-cheek alluding to the fact that Sanskrit, I mean, the meaning of the word for the Sanskrit language is not connected to the people who speak it or the place where they live. It's a description of how it's put together. It's well formed. That's what Sanskrita means, and it's precise. And yet, at the same time, in different contexts, words can have very different meanings. Yes. And so the precision is there in compactness of expression. So you don't need many words to say a lot, but you do need a good understanding of the context in which the words are being used to get the right impression of what
that's really important, isn't it? And that's the basis of the sutra. The sutras are these very condensed words, aphorisms, but you need to understand the context of the meaning of the words in order to really get it. And it's very open to misinterpretation if you don't have that, I think.
Absolutely, and that's the inspiration for writing the book, really. And the second thing I should probably say by way of introduction is, I'm a white guy from England, and although I've been traveling to India for getting on for 25 years now and studying yoga with traditional teachers, I'm from outside of the culture in which yoga originated, and yet I've made it my business to become as well versed in that as I can. And I teach at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, There are folk, and we teach Sanskrit as well as yoga philosophy. And so I've really been struck by the way in which modern yoga is decontextualized from that sort of original context in Indian traditions. And I wanted to strip away some of the things that are added to yoga in the modern marketplace, a lot of new age ideas for the most part, and prosperity gospel style, kind of affirmations in front of the mirror every morning, and you shall be healthy and fit, and to see what are the ideas that have influenced yoga over the centuries as it's developed, coming from Indian traditions, and in a way that's ultimately the source of inspiration for what yoga has become, even if yoga is now very different to what those texts are talking about. And there is a common truth in them. It's fashionable in scholarship, and has been for several decades now, to sort of question whether there can be any such thing as a universal truth, and in fact to dismantle the very idea and talk in terms of discourses that compete with one another. And the history of yoga is full of them. There is no one true yoga. There are many yogas, and they say different things at different times, and you can get very confused if you imagine they're speaking the same language. And yet there are one or two common threads that seem to be there in most of them. And we misperceive reality as human beings.
So that's an important one, isn't it?
Yeah, and this misperception, this avidya, this misunderstanding of who we really are, is the source of our suffering. And the traditions of yoga have, in various different ways, tried to cut through that with a practical method for revealing the truth to ourselves. And of course, then we can question whether we all see the same truth, or it doesn't really matter. The sort of prospect being held up is that there is something beyond conventional perception. It's accessible to us all, and there are things we can do. And if we don't do that, we're going to make ourselves miserable. That's sort of one underlying principle. And the second common principle, I think, is the nature of what one does. It involves some form of disciplined effort, but ultimately the disciplined effort is to let go. It's a real sort of paradox. It's to let go of the fixed ideas we have about ourselves and the world, to somehow perceive from a place that is beyond that conceptualization process. So yoga is a state beyond the mind, basically, and it's also therefore a state beyond words. So it's very hard to describe what it is, let alone to make bold truth claims.
Do you think we could say, and I'm just thinking this off the top of my head, but the first proposition that you gave there about we basically don't understand reality, or we misperceive avidya. Could we link that with jnana yoga? And the second one, which is about how we act in the world, could we link that with karma yoga? Do you think that's fair?
That's certainly the way in which the Gita breaks things down. The Bhagavad Gita has many different yogas in it. I mean, it's sometimes reduced to three: karma yoga, jnana yoga, bhakti yoga. But then there's also dhyana yoga, meditative yoga, and buddhi yoga, and each chapter is sometimes called a yoga. So it gets very confusing. And I think really, in some ways, the knowledge and the action are the same thing. They're two sides of the same coin. Certainly in the way that the Gita presents it. I mean, that's its innovation, really. It says, unlike most other traditions of yoga, which have said that in order to correct this misperception, you've basically got to stop engaging with the world, because through the mind and the senses, we're drawn out to get attached to the things that we like and to try and avoid the things we dislike. And we're therefore constantly rearranging reality to make ourselves feel better. Add to that the problem of the mind and its desire to tell stories about how wonderful we are, and it's very difficult to see clearly, because we're constantly constructing this picture that makes us feel better, except it makes us feel worse, because reality keeps changing, so we have to keep reconstructing it. Sort of miserable process goes on. So the easiest way is to have no further involvement with the world, never do anything again, and there'll be no more sort of misinformation fed through the senses to the mind, and eventually the mind can be sort of rolled up into a ball, thrown away into the waste paper basket. But the Gita says, well, no, you can be in the world if you act with clarity and insight, with an understanding that this whole project of trying to feed little me in the mind, compelling stories about it's important, and also trying to satisfy ourselves. That's the way to be miserable. But if you can let that go, you can act with no problem. There is no problem of karma if you're not seeking personal gain. From there comes the idea of selfless service, and the interconnectedness of everyone through love, and eventually sort of built into the whole philosophy of devotion. But it's the wisdom that makes action wise, is to let go of this self-serving worldview, and
it's a kind of getting out of your own way, basically, and letting something else.
And that's sort of that for us in the modern era is a lot more liberating, I think, that realization that we can be part of society and yet still enjoy some of the fruits of yoga. Perhaps not the ultimate states where we leave the world behind and just disappear into this timeless transcendence, but certainly enough of it that we dial down the volume on the suffering and can enjoy at least a measure of contentment.
So some of the ancient insights are still very practical, even if we're living in a different world. Which leads me to my next question, Daniel, which is, again, something you mentioned earlier, which was that, you're a white guy. I'm pretty much a white guy. I mean, I don't know what I am. I'm some kind of, okay, I've got an Indian name and my dad's Bengali, but, I was brought up in the UK, and although I love India and I've been to India many times, I suppose culturally I've been brought up in the UK more. And I was going to say that you've done you did your MA at SOAS, and you work presumably with, current the kind of big shots of Jim Mallinson and Mark Singleton and those guys who were teaching at SOAS. I was just wondering whether there's been a bit of a renaissance in kind of Indian studies within the Western academic scene, particularly at SOAS and also in America as well. And I was kind of reflecting on how that compares with the Renaissance of the late 19th century, the 19th century and the early 20th century, when there was also a lot of interest in Sanskrit and, Indian philosophy. And the times then was such that India was a colonized country. The colonizers, if you like, the Westerners were kind of going over there, and it led to some quite patronizing takes on Indian philosophy. You've quoted a couple. I mean, I think you quoted Max Muller sort of rather dismissively talking about the sort of decay of the rational, the transition from rational beginnings to irrational exaggerations, and this tendency of degradation from intellectual to practical yoga, something along those lines. Do you think that the scholarship of the colonial times is different from the scholarship of now? Do you think the Westerners who are now kind of looking at yoga will fall foul of the same kind of patronizing attitudes, or do you think there's a difference?
It's an excellent question, Ranju, and very, very topical. And I think, without wanting to generalize too much, in modern India in particular, and also online, with, again, largely Indian diaspora influence on this, there is an understandable skepticism about white people pontificating about these things, and there's a natural tendency to make the connection back to the 19th century, and I think that leads to a misreading in some cases of what's going on here. And I think the only way to correct that is to be honest about what happened in the 19th century, and I've tried to do that in the book, and explain that, the reason that Westerners were studying these texts, were studying local languages, was to have a better chance of subjugating the natives and exploiting them, and that was the project. It so happened that some of the people involved in the project of colonizing India were also fascinated by the traditions they encountered, and were in love with these things in their own right and in their own way, and therefore translated texts, made things available for the benefit of mankind. And yet, somehow behind the whole project was this idea of, we need to better understand what's influenced these people, and we need to therefore try and use that to our advantage.
Sure.
and then dismissing ultimately, is another quote I got from Thomas Macaulay, who sort of dismissed the entire literature of Arabia and India as not worth one shelf of a European library.
I was actually looking for that quote. I was just flicking through. I was trying to find it before we came on air, because that's also an incredibly damning quote, isn't it? I mean,
of course, you know, and the arrogance and hubris on display there is evident. You know, and people understandably look to that today and say, well, you know, white men don't change. And there's a lot of evidence in the modern yoga sphere that would suggest that's the case. There's a lot of opportunist exploitation of Indian traditions for commercial advantage without a great deal of respect for where they've come from. Yes. However, I think to kind of conflate that with the scholars who are currently engaged in studying these traditions very closely is another big mistake. They're motivated for the most part by a love for these traditions. They're almost all of them practitioners, and they might disguise that to a certain extent in their scholarship. They don't talk about it, you know, as something they're engaged in for their own spiritual development, for example. But they're inspired to study these things because they care about them, and they have in their work, I think, shown respect for traditions and for the truth ultimately. And unfortunately, respect for the traditions and respect for the truth can sometimes come into conflict. And I think Mark Singleton is a classic case study in that. His book, Yoga Body, that made a lot of waves 10 years or so ago.
Upset a lot of people.
Yes, and he wrote that in a way that I think he could have perhaps reconsidered a little to not be so quite deliberately provocative, but at the same time I understand why he was, because he was looking at all these stories that people had told about the history of yoga and they just weren't true.
Scratching his head thinking,
there wasn't any evidence for them, and yet there was a lot of evidence to suggest that there were other influences involved in the creation of modern postural yoga practices that hadn't been talked about very much, certainly not by the sort of living lineage holders of such traditions as Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga, and so he quite understandably wanted to say, hang on a minute guys, you need to face the reality here. But that inevitably ends up being a little bit sort of disdainful towards the tradition. He says in Yoga Body that there's there is basically no connection between modern physical yoga practice and medieval hatha yoga, and he's gone on to modify that position somewhat, and it's just really not true basically either. So the pendulum can swing too far the other way, but I think the reason it tends to is because the truth is certainly in terms of historical context and some of the more worldly influences on what's been presented and taught, and not so often talked about as the lofty sort of timeless goals that might have inspired the whole project. And that's part of the myth making that goes into inventing tradition. But traditions evolve, everything changes, and I think there's a huge reverence for timelessness in Indian traditions, which I find really liberating as well. There's nothing more boring sometimes in this attempt to pin everything down in some sort of linear narrative, which is the great project of the Whig version of history. That's sort of again coming out of that times of the old colonial era. But we do have to acknowledge as well that there are specific influences at specific times that change things, and it isn't all one unchanging tradition. It's evolved, and it's evolved for specific reasons, and different things have been combined in different ways, and the ultimate truth therefore is that there is no one truth, and that there's been a lot of reinvention, and there's been a lot of exchange of ideas between different traditions, not just within yoga, but between yoga and Buddhism, Jainism, the interaction with Islamic practitioners of yoga as well, even with Christians. So it's a whole soup of all these different influences in the end, and that's what people are reluctant to talk about a lot of the time. They're much easier to paper it over.
Which leads me, Daniel, to page 26 of your book, which is another little paragraph, which is a great paragraph, I think. But I'm just going to read it out to maybe you might want to say something.
Go ahead. Yeah. I'm now nervous of what I might have said.
It's great. Many ancient traditions are said to be timeless. Hindu nationalists highlight this message to obscure how they developed from diverse sources. A standardized version of Hinduism is increasingly aligned with the Indian state, while minorities are marginalized. However, it's hard to find a unifying doctrine that covers all Hindus, even if the Vedas include an era that helps make even if the Vedas include an idea that helps make sense of this. The wise speak of what is one in many ways, one hymn explains. There is therefore unity behind different forms, as expressed in this verse from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. And you quote the verse, Om Purnada, this is the whole, that is the whole arises from the whole. If you take the whole from the whole, only the whole remains. The Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Udachyate verse. So you've very strongly said that there is no single culture, it's not a monoculture. There are so many minorities, there are so many different traditions, and I really like that. I don't know whether you want to add anything to that.
Well, I mean, yeah, in some ways I'll let it speak for itself, but there probably is more one should say, which is, this whole question of where yoga comes from is part of a bigger question about, the ancient history of India, and control of that narrative is allied to a political project of identifying India as a homeland of what we now know of the Hindu religion. People who adhere to that religion are the natural residents of this space, whereas the term Hindu was originally used for those who lived east of the Indus River. So no matter what their religious affiliation, and a lot of the texts on yoga make it very clear that they're non-sectarian, especially the physical yoga practices. But throughout the history of yoga, it's a sort of free-floating spiritual discipline that can be allied to almost any philosophy. The aim is the project of trying to transcend this myth-making factory in the head. Unfortunately, that idea has been allied to a project of myth-making, and this current innovation of World Yoga Day, sponsored by the Indian Prime Minister, sounds on the surface like a lovely thing. We can all celebrate around the world that this practice of yoga, this great gift of India to the world, is universal now, and many people can see very clearly past cultural difference to an interconnectedness that they share through their interest in this discipline. But if the stories behind this are all about the ancient timelessness of everything, and ultimately, the sort of origin of all that's great and good in India, and that's kind of subtly aligned with the Hindutva project of saying India is the homeland of the Hindus, and anybody who doesn't like it can, Yogi Adityanath, the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, once said, if you don't want to do Surya Namaskar at school, you can, drown yourself in the ocean. So it's got to recognize that these stories have political purposes, and that really, therefore, as a nice starry-eyed yoga practitioner outside of India, we need to be a little bit careful about what we're endorsing, what we're perhaps on the internet, uncritically reposting, some of the ideas that people align themselves with without really understanding their deeper significance, especially while thinking of themselves as sort of progressively minded. And it's awkward to talk about this. It's not going to earn me any friends, perhaps, but I think if we're interested in the truth, we've got to go there.
Yeah. But it also brings me to the last point. We've just got a few minutes left, but not only is there a great discussion about the origin stories of yoga, but also where are we going? Where are we going, Daniel? There's this huge mixture. You've talked about the pizza effect, and we know of sadhus living in remote places now who have their own Instagram accounts, and we've got yoga being advertising bank accounts and yogurt drinks and everything. Are we just going down the drain in Kali Yuga, or is there hope?
Well, I think it's up to each of us, isn't it? It's very easy to point the finger at what everybody else is doing, and to a certain extent, I suppose what I just said about politics sounded a little bit that way, and the increasing politicization of everything, yeah, makes people very keen to point out where others are going wrong. And I don't know. I mean, I think the main thing is to think about what we're interested in for our own spiritual benefit if we're yoga practitioners. That means being discerning and trying to decide whether any of that stuff is useful to us. If it isn't, we can actually ignore it. It's there. People have always taken ideas and exploited them and tried to make money out of them. You know, yoga's a fad and has been now for so long that I keep waiting for the bubble to burst. But it carries on inflating. One day people will move on, and the practice of yoga will remain. And those who are interested in engaging with it need therefore to be taking care to make sure they're doing something that's helpful. I mean, there's a basic algorithm if we're talking the language of modernity in the future. Is this conducive to decreasing suffering, or is it something that makes me suffer more? And that's really the basic binary question to be asked at all times. And ultimately, if we're then going to extend it out beyond ourselves, does this contribute to the decrease of suffering more broadly in society, or is it increasing it? And if we're just asking those questions, I think we've got fairly good sort of divining rod to navigate the territory.
That's a nice idea, actually, Daniel. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. But
ultimately, I mean, who knows? Unfortunately, although I like to practice yoga and had some degree of I hesitate to even use the word, but texts talk about it, success in practice, attainment. I'm certainly very much beginner level when it comes to defining these things in Patanjali's terms, where
you can't make yourself invisible.
With 35 sutras or so, all devoted to the wonderful supernatural powers when attained. Yeah. And I don't have wonderful, clear knowledge of the ancient past any more than I have of the distant future. I'm sadly stuck here right now, and all I can see is these trends.
Well, that's absolutely that's as it should be, and that's as it is, Daniel. So that's great. We've just got 5 minutes. We've got a few minutes left. So, Daniel, what next for you after this book? What are you thinking of? Where's it going? What are you going to do with this book?
Well, first of all, I mean, I'm turning my book into an online course, which should be launching soon, and my aim is to really try and bring the clarity that scholars have brought to this topic over the last 20 years to a much wider audience. Many people learn to teach yoga. They do, in some cases, this very condensed 200-hour teacher training in the space of a few weeks. Are taught, a few basic facts about what's in the Yoga Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita, often dressed up to rationalize what's being taught in the other 190 hours of the program. And I just would like to try and bring a bit more clarity to what the tradition says about itself on the one hand. On the other hand, what scholars have identified that question some of these traditional narratives about where things come from, and therefore to give us better context for understanding our relationship with the past. And I think that's the real question to be bringing up in yoga teacher training is, do we even want a relationship to the past? But then if we don't want one, why call what we're doing yoga? If it's not in any way interested in anything else that's been called yoga in the past, then does it really deserve something else? Yeah, indeed. And so I think that's a key question to moving forwards. And then for myself, what I would like to do is ultimately write another book, which looks at the reality. We live in the 21st century. We're not seeing the world from the perspective of an Iron Age ascetic or a religious devotee of 2,000 years ago, or a medieval hatha yogin or a tantrika living in the cremation ground. We live in society in the 21st century surrounded by technology, and yet these ideas are still helpful. The human mind is still much as it was, although technology wants to fuse us with with all manner of other things to overcome those defects. But yeah, we need to find in some ways our own 21st century yoga philosophy. So my idea with this book was to lay out sort of 100 key themes that have influenced yoga as it's developed up to this point. I think from here, perhaps it'd be interesting to see how we turn all of that into a model for Western yoga in a way. That hasn't really developed. There hasn't been an acknowledgement that it's a bit different. So I'd almost like to bring that, right out into the open and say, how do we have a relationship with the past, and yet also acknowledge that our present is different, and take this thing forward somewhere that's speaking about now.
Great. Well, that is a laudable ambition, and I think that's a great place also to end the interview and wrap up now. That was a really lovely description of, the lovely discussion about both the book and also some of the major themes in the book. Thank you very much, Daniel. Great talking to you.
Pleasure to chat to you.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Daniel Simpson and Ranju Roy, for these much needed insights into the origins and practice of yoga, particularly useful in the new normal. We thank our celebration partner, Diageo. And thank you all for watching and being such a lovely audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and while we have braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we have struggled to ensure that we can continue to bring you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We would love for you to support us at Teamwork Arts. Any contribution is welcome and would help spread knowledge and ideas seamlessly against all odds. You can also tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 @Jaipur Lit Fest. Remember, the festival is protected by Dettol. Hope to see you in the next session. Thank you.